Well now, ain't that just something? I tell you, life sure can throw us some curveballs, can't it? This story of Sarah's, it's one for the books, that's for sure. You know, I was sitting here, just sipping on my tea, listening to her pour her heart out, and I couldn't help but think, good gracious, that poor woman. But you know what they say, a mother's love is as tough as nails. Now, before I go any further, I want to hear from all of you lovely folks out there. Where are you tuning in from today? Go on and drop me a little comment, won't you? And if you're new around these parts, be sure to hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, and it really does help us keep bringing you more stories like this one. Believe me, I know Sarah would appreciate it. All right, now back to the story. This Sarah, she's one tough cookie, I'll give her that. Raising a son like John, only to have him turn around and betray her like that? Goodness, I can't even imagine. But you know, that's the thing about family. They can hurt you in ways no one else can. And poor Robert, having to go through all that while he was already fighting for his life. It's just heartbreaking. Now, let me paint you a proper picture of Sarah before all this madness started, because I think it's important you understand just how much she had to lose. Sarah Elizabeth Montgomery, that was her maiden name. She grew up in a little town in upstate New York, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody else's business. Her daddy worked at the local factory, and her mama took in sewing to make ends meet. They didn't have much, but what they had was love and values, the kind you can't put a price tag on. Sarah was always the brightest student in her class, got herself a full scholarship to college, which was just unheard of for a girl from her neighborhood back in those days. She studied business administration and worked 3 jobs to cover her living expenses, because that scholarship only paid for tuition. 3 jobs. Can you imagine? She'd be up at 5 in the morning, cleaning offices, then off to classes, then working at the library in the afternoons, and waitressing at a diner most evenings. The girl barely slept, but she was determined to make something of herself. That's where she met Robert, actually, at that diner. He'd come in every Tuesday and Thursday night, always ordered the same thing: coffee, black, and a slice of apple pie. Sarah said she noticed him because he was always reading these thick business magazines and making notes in the margins. He was working as a junior accountant at a small firm then, but he had big dreams, just like she did. It took him 3 months to work up the courage to ask her out. 3 months of Tuesday and Thursday visits, leaving generous tips and making small talk about the weather and how her studies were going. Finally, one night in December, right before Christmas break, he asked if she'd like to go to a movie with him sometime. Sarah said yes, before he even finished the sentence. They got married 2 years later, right after Sarah graduated. It was a small wedding at the local courthouse because they were both saving every penny they could. Robert's family didn't come. They'd never approved of him marrying a girl from such humble beginnings, thought he could do better. That should have been Sarah's first clue about how cruel family could be when they thought someone wasn't good enough. But she was young and in love, and figured they'd come around eventually. They never did. Robert's parents passed away years later without ever having met their grandson, John. Their loss, if you ask me. Now, Sarah and Robert, they built their business from absolutely nothing. Robert had this idea about consulting services for small businesses, helping them with their accounting and financial planning. Sarah handled all the administrative work, the marketing, the client relations. They worked out of their tiny apartment for the first 5 years, living on beans and rice most nights, putting every cent back into the business. Sarah was pregnant with John during those early years, working right up until the day her water broke. She always joked that John was born understanding spreadsheets, because she'd been doing the books with him, kicking in her belly for months. And oh, how they loved that boy. John Robert Harrison came into this world on a rainy April morning, weighing 7 pounds and 3 ounces, with a full head of dark hair, just like his daddy. Sarah said the moment they placed him in her arms, she understood what people meant when they talked about love at first sight. She'd have done anything for that child, given him the moon and stars if she could reach them. Robert was the same way. He'd come home from long days of building their business, exhausted down to his bones, but he'd always have energy to play with John, to read him stories, to teach him things. By the time John was 5, he could already count to 100 and was reading books meant for kids twice his age. They thought they'd raised a little genius. Maybe they had. But as it turned out, being smart and being good aren't the same thing at all. The business really took off when John was about 7 years old. They landed this big contract with a manufacturing company that had locations all over the Northeast, and suddenly they weren't struggling anymore. They moved out of that cramped apartment into a proper house with a yard where John could play. Sarah could finally stop working 3 side jobs and focus on the business full-time. They hired their first employees, expanded their services, and within 10 years, they'd built something real, something valuable. Sarah made sure John never wanted for anything. Good schools, music lessons, sports teams, summer camps. Whatever he showed interest in, they made sure he had access to the best. But here's the thing Sarah told me that really stuck with me. She said she always made sure John understood the value of hard work, too. He had to earn his allowance by doing chores, had to get good grades if he wanted privileges, had to be respectful and kind to others. Or at least, that's what she thought she was teaching him. John was always a charming boy, the kind who could talk his way out of trouble with a smile and a quick apology. Teachers loved him. Other parents thought he was delightful, and he always seemed to know exactly what to say to make people feel special. Sarah thought it was a gift. Looking back now, she wonders if it was more of a warning sign, that ability to manipulate people so easily. He went to a good college, studied business like his parents, and came back to join the family company. Sarah and Robert were over the moon about it. Their dream was to build something they could pass down to John, something that would take care of him and his future family for generations. They gave him a position in management right away, taught him everything they knew about running the business, about treating clients right, about building relationships based on trust. John seemed to take to it naturally. He was good with clients, closed big deals, brought fresh ideas to the table. Sarah was so proud she could have burst. She'd bragged to her friends about how well John was doing, how he was going to take the company to even greater heights than she and Robert had. Robert felt the same way. He'd put his arm around John at company events and introduce him as the future of Harrison and Associates. They started talking about succession planning, about gradually transitioning John into more leadership roles. That's when John met Melissa Chen. Now, Sarah said she tried to like Melissa. She really did. But there was something about that girl that just didn't sit right from the very beginning. Melissa came from money, old money, the kind where your great-great-grandfather made a fortune in railroads or oil or something like that. She had this way of looking at things that weren't expensive, like they were beneath her. You know what I mean? She'd come to Sunday dinners at Sarah and Robert's house and make these little comments about the furniture being quaint or the neighborhood being charming in a simple way. Just little digs that you couldn't quite call her out on, but that made you feel small. John was absolutely smitten with her, though. Said she was sophisticated, worldly, ambitious. Sarah watched her son change after he started dating Melissa. He started caring more about appearances, about what car he drove and what restaurants he was seen at. He started talking about money differently, not as something you earned through hard work, but as something you deserved, something you were owed. When John and Melissa got engaged after just 8 months of dating, Sarah had concerns. But what could she say? Her son was 32 years old, a grown man, and he seemed happy. Robert told her to give Melissa a chance. That maybe she was just nervous around them, and that's why she seemed standoffish. Always seeing the best in people. That was Robert. The wedding was this enormous affair that Melissa's parents paid for, thank goodness, because it must have cost more than Sarah and Robert had spent on their first house. 300 guests, a live orchestra, flowers flown in from South America, champagne that cost more per bottle than Sarah used to make in a week when she was working those 3 jobs. Sarah felt out of place the entire time, like she was attending someone else's family's celebration rather than her own son's wedding. And Melissa's parents, the Chens, they made sure everyone knew they thought their daughter was marrying beneath her. Sarah overheard Melissa's mother telling someone that it was sweet that John had built himself up from nothing, but that she hoped he'd be able to keep up with Melissa's lifestyle expectations. Sarah wanted to march right over there and give that woman a piece of her mind, but Robert squeezed her hand and reminded her it was John's day, not a day for family drama. The grandchildren came along pretty quickly after that. First Emma, then 2 years later, little Sophie. Sarah fell in love with those girls the moment she saw them. They had John's dark hair, but Melissa's delicate features, and they were just precious. Sarah would have spent every day with them if she could, but Melissa made it difficult. There were always rules about when Sarah could visit, what she could bring them, what activities were appropriate. Melissa didn't want the girls eating sugar, didn't want them watching television, didn't want them getting dirty playing outside. Sarah bit her tongue so many times she's surprised it didn't fall off, but she did it because she wanted to be part of her granddaughters' lives. Then Robert got sick. It started with him feeling tired all the time, which wasn't unusual given how hard he worked. But then came the weight loss, the night sweats, the pain he tried to hide, but Sarah could see in his eyes. The diagnosis was stage 3 lymphoma, and their whole world just stopped. Suddenly, none of the business stuff mattered. None of the money mattered. All that mattered was fighting for Robert's life. The treatment was brutal. Sarah had never seen her strong, capable husband reduced to such weakness. He'd spend days in bed after chemotherapy, barely able to keep down water, and Sarah would sit beside him holding his hand, trying to be strong for both of them. John came to visit during those first few weeks, brought the girls by to cheer up their grandpa. But as the months wore on, and Robert's treatment stretched from weeks to months, John's visits became less frequent. He was busy with the company, he said. Someone had to keep things running while Robert was out. Sarah understood, or at least she tried to. The company was important, and John was stepping up to keep their life's work going. What she didn't know was what John was really doing during that time. It wasn't until months later, after everything had blown up, that Sarah learned the full extent of it. While Robert was fighting cancer, barely able to get out of bed some days, John had been systematically restructuring the company. He'd convinced the board, which included several of his and Melissa's friends, that they needed to modernize the ownership structure. He'd started moving assets around, creating new subsidiary companies, changing beneficiaries on key accounts, and he'd been doing it all with forged signatures on documents, claiming Robert had signed them during good days when he was feeling better. The sick thing was, John had been planning this even before Robert got sick. Sarah found emails later, dated from 2 years before Robert's diagnosis, where John and Melissa were discussing their inheritance timeline and how to accelerate the process, like they were talking about a business merger instead of their parents' deaths. Melissa's parents had apparently lost a lot of money in some bad investments, and suddenly Melissa's expensive lifestyle wasn't so secure anymore. They needed John's inheritance, needed it sooner rather than later. Sarah had noticed some things weren't quite right, even during Robert's illness. Bills that should have been paid automatically were coming up past due, client calls that weren't being returned, employees leaving without being replaced. But every time she asked John about it, he'd tell her not to worry, that he had everything under control, that she needed to focus on taking care of Robert. She trusted him because he was her son, because she couldn't imagine that her own child would betray them when they were at their most vulnerable. The real wake-up call came from the most unexpected place. Robert's nurse, a wonderful woman named Grace, who'd been coming to the house 5 days a week to help with his care. Grace had mentioned to Sarah one day that she hadn't been paid in 3 weeks, and when she'd called the company's accounts payable department, they said they'd never received authorization to pay her. Sarah knew that was wrong because she'd signed those authorizations herself. That's when she started digging, and honey, what she found made her blood run cold. Thousands of dollars missing from accounts, payments being redirected to companies Sarah had never heard of, contracts being cancelled, and the termination fees disappearing into nowhere. She called their longtime accountant, a man named Harold Chen, no relation to Melissa's family, who'd been doing their books for 15 years. Harold was shocked when Sarah started asking questions because he hadn't been getting the financial statements he needed to do his job properly. John had told him that Sarah and Robert wanted to simplify things and were handling more of the bookkeeping in-house. That's when Sarah knew something was seriously wrong, because she and Robert had always believed in letting professionals handle the finances. That was literally what their whole business was built on. She couldn't tell Robert, not while he was so sick, so weak from the treatment. The stress might have killed him faster than the cancer. So Sarah did something she never thought she'd have to do. She started investigating her own son. She hired a private investigator, a friend of a friend named Margaret, who'd retired from the police force. Margaret was thorough, discreet, and good at her job. What she uncovered over the next 6 weeks was devastating. John had embezzled over $2 million from the company. He'd created fake vendor accounts and been paying them for services never rendered, with the money going into offshore accounts. He'd taken out loans against company assets, loans that Sarah and Robert would be personally liable for. He'd even started selling off company equipment and pocketing the money. And the worst part? He'd been changing Robert's medical directives and insurance beneficiaries. Margaret found documents, forged, obviously, but they looked legitimate, that would have made John the sole beneficiary of Robert's life insurance and would have given him power of attorney over Robert's medical decisions. Sarah realized with growing horror that John wasn't just stealing from them. He was positioning himself to potentially make life or death decisions about Robert's care, decisions that would benefit him financially if Robert didn't make it. Her son was essentially waiting for his father to die so he could cash in. That realization broke something in Sarah. She told me she spent an entire night sitting in her car in the driveway, unable to go back into the house where her dying husband slept and where pictures of John's smiling face hung on every wall. She said she screamed until her voice gave out, cried until she had no tears left, and then, finally, she got angry. And honey, let me tell you, an angry mother is a force to be reckoned with. Sarah went to the FBI, not the local police, but straight to the federal agents, because the offshore accounts and the wire fraud meant this was beyond local jurisdiction. She brought them every piece of evidence Margaret had collected, every forged document, every suspicious transaction. She sat in that office for 6 hours, going through everything, watching the agents' expressions change from skepticism to shock to grim determination. They opened an investigation immediately. For the next 3 months, while Robert continued his cancer treatment, while John kept coming by the house playing the concerned son, Sarah had to pretend everything was normal. She had to sit across the dinner table from John and make small talk while wearing a wire. She had to watch him hold Emma and Sophie, being a father to them, all while knowing what he'd been doing. The FBI wanted to build an airtight case, and that meant letting John continue his activities while they gathered evidence. It was the hardest thing Sarah had ever done, and that's saying something, considering she was also caring for her dying husband and trying to keep their business from completely collapsing. Robert started getting better, miraculously. The cancer went into remission, and slowly, day by day, he started regaining his strength. Sarah had never prayed so hard in her life because she needed Robert to survive. She needed him to see justice done, to know that she'd protected them both, to have a chance at some kind of life after all this nightmare was over. The day they arrested John was a Tuesday. Sarah had insisted on being there when it happened. John had called a special board meeting, supposedly to discuss transitioning leadership, now that Robert was recovering. Sarah and Robert both showed up, which surprised John. He'd expected Robert to still be too weak to attend. The FBI agents came in right as John was starting his presentation about why Robert should step down as CEO. You should have seen his face when they read him his rights. First confusion, then disbelief, then this flash of pure rage that Sarah had never seen on her son's face before. He looked right at her and said, "You did this? To your own son?" And Sarah, bless her heart, she stood up in front of that whole room, the board members, the FBI agents, the lawyers, and she said, "No, John, I stopped you from doing this to us. There's a difference." They found even more evidence once they had access to John's computers and files. He'd been planning to have Robert declared incompetent due to his illness, had already started the paperwork. He'd been in contact with several companies about selling off major parts of Harrison and Associates. He had plane tickets booked to the Cayman Islands for him and Melissa, scheduled for just 2 weeks after that board meeting. They were going to take the money and run, leave Sarah and Robert holding the bag for millions in debt and a company stripped of its assets. Melissa was arrested too, later that same day. She tried to claim she didn't know anything about it, that John had done it all without her knowledge, but the prosecutors had emails, text messages, joint account statements. She'd been in on it from the beginning. The trial was 8 months later. Sarah had to sit there day after day, listening to lawyers dissect her family's life, hearing the details of how her son had plotted against them. The defense tried to argue that John had just been trying to secure his future, that he'd panicked when his parents got older and sicker, that it was motivated by fear rather than greed. But the prosecution laid out the timeline, showed the jury how John had been planning this for years, how he'd actively worked to make Robert sicker by stress, how he'd been prepared to let his father die to speed up his inheritance. John never showed any remorse, even when they played recordings of him and Melissa laughing about how the old man wouldn't be around much longer, how Mother Dear was too trusting to ever catch on. John just sat there stone-faced. Sarah wanted to see some hint of the boy she'd raised, some sign that there was still a soul in there capable of feeling guilt or shame. She never saw it. The verdict came back guilty on all counts. 22 years in federal prison for John, 18 for Melissa. The judge said it was one of the most callous cases of elder abuse and financial exploitation she'd seen in her career. Melissa's parents were in the courtroom, crying and carrying on about how their daughter's life was ruined. Sarah just sat there holding Robert's hand, feeling numb. Emma and Sophie, those poor babies, they went to live with Melissa's parents. Sarah tried to get visitation rights, but the Chens blocked it, said Sarah was the reason their daughter was in prison, that the girls didn't need that influence in their lives. It broke Sarah's heart all over again, losing those grandbabies on top of everything else. But you know what? Sarah and Robert, they survived. They sold that big house with all its painful memories and bought a smaller place by a lake a few hours away. They rebuilt the business from the ground up, hired new management they could trust, and eventually sold it to a larger firm for enough money to retire comfortably. Robert's cancer stayed in remission, thank the Lord. They started traveling, something they'd always put off because they were too busy building the business. They went to Italy, to Japan, to New Zealand. They made new memories in places that didn't remind them of John. Sarah started volunteering with organizations that help elderly people protect themselves from financial exploitation. She gives talks at senior centers, sharing her story, teaching people the warning signs. She's helped dozens of families avoid what she went through, caught things early before too much damage was done. She says it gives her purpose, turns her pain into something useful. And after about 5 years, something amazing happened. Sarah got a call from a social worker in the city where Melissa's parents lived. Apparently, the Chens had passed away in a car accident, and Emma and Sophie, now teenagers, needed a guardian. The social worker had found Sarah's information in the girls' files and wanted to know if she'd be interested in taking them. Sarah said she and Robert didn't even hesitate. They drove 12 hours straight to get to those girls. Emma and Sophie remembered them, had actually been wanting to find them for years, but hadn't known how. Melissa's parents had told them terrible lies about Sarah and Robert, but the girls were old enough now to have questions, to do their own research, to understand that their father had done awful things. It wasn't easy at first. The girls had a lot of trauma to work through, a lot of anger about what their parents had done and how their grandparents had lied to them. But Sarah and Robert, they'd waited so long to have their granddaughters back, and they weren't going to waste a single day of it. They got the girls into therapy, enrolled them in good schools, and most importantly, they gave them a stable, loving home where honesty actually meant something. Emma's in college now, studying to be a social worker. She wants to help kids from broken homes, wants to be the kind of person who could have helped her when she needed it. Sophie's still in high school, talking about becoming a lawyer because she says she wants to make sure people like her dad face justice. Both girls have gone to see John in prison, but only once. They needed to tell him how what he did affected them, needed to ask him why he valued money more than his family. Sarah said they came back from that visit looking lighter somehow, like they'd set down a weight they'd been carrying. John's up for parole in about 7 more years. Sarah knows, because they notify her automatically as a victim of his crimes. She doesn't know what she'll do if he gets out early. Part of her thinks she should show up at that parole hearing, tell them how he destroyed their family, make sure he serves every single day of his sentence. Another part of her just wants to be done with it, to have him stay in the past where he belongs. Robert says they'll cross that bridge when they come to it, that right now they should focus on the good things, the grandkids, their life by the lake, the people they're helping through Sarah's volunteer work. And he's right, of course. He usually is. That's been their approach to the whole thing, really. They can't change what John did or who he turned out to be, but they can choose how they move forward. So they focus on Emma and Sophie, on showing those girls what real family looks like. They focus on protecting other elderly people from the kind of betrayal they suffered. They focus on each other and the life they still have left to live. Sarah told me something that really stuck with me. She said, "You know, people always say blood is thicker than water, like family bonds are the strongest thing there is. But I learned that blood doesn't mean much when it's poisoned by greed. The real family, the real bonds, those are the ones you choose to keep and nurture. John was my blood, but he stopped being my family the day he chose money over love. Emma and Sophie, though, they chose to come back to us, chose to rebuild those bridges. That's what real family looks like. And isn't that just the truth? Family isn't just about who you're related to. It's about who shows up for you, who stays loyal when things get hard, who values you for who you are, and not what you can give them. John forgot that, or maybe he never learned it in the first place. But Sarah and Robert, they know it down to their bones now. They built themselves back up from nothing once before, and they did it again after John tried to tear it all down. Sarah's 74 now, Robert's 76, and they're living their best lives. They've got a little dock on that lake where they sit every evening watching the sunset. They've got 2 granddaughters who call them every day, who come home for holidays, who are building good lives for themselves despite everything they've been through. They've got each other, still holding hands after all these years, still fighting for their love and their life together. So that's Sarah's story, and I tell you what, it's one that reminds me that the human spirit is tougher than we give it credit for. We can survive betrayals we never thought possible, rebuild from ruins we thought would bury us, and find joy again, even when it seems impossible. But you know, I'm glad Sarah found that peace in the end, even if it came at such a heavy price. Selling that big old house, moving to a place by the lake where the memories of Robert aren't tainted, that sounds just lovely. And to be able to be there for her grandkids, to show them what a real home looks like, well, That's the kind of legacy I'd want to leave, that's for sure. Anyway, I've rambled on long enough, haven't I? If you liked this story, be sure to let me know. And remember, there's more where this came from. So click on that box to the left and let's see what other tales I've got to share. Until next time, y'all take care now. You hear?